Welcome to the Psychedelic Spotlight Podcast. This is your host, Matthew. Today, I'm excited to present to you our conversation with Arrowyn Ambrose. Arrowyn is an advanced certified facilitator of the Resistance Toolkit and the community program coordinator at Lumos Transforms. She is a certified teaching artist and a certified race, equity, and healing justice facilitator. She has studied Viola Spolin's long-form organic improvisation, creative writing, addiction, and group dynamics. With a background in the creative and performing arts, Arrowyn believes in the healing power of story and is passionate about ethical storytelling, along with trauma-informed and resilience-oriented recovery, parenting, and social justice. So the primary topic of our conversation was psychedelics and recovery. How are psychedelics integrated into recovery? What are all the facets of recovery that we need to consider in order to get a more pervasively effective result? Who is experiencing what in the recovery landscape? And how do we help those in most need, but perhaps with not the most access to new or ancient therapies that could be of incredible use? Arrowyn is very candid with us in this discussion, and I appreciate that so much. I think we really do need to drill down into the awkwardness of these complex topics in order to get to a point where we can have a clear understanding, some clear, usable takeaway. Recovery under the 12-step program is a very particular methodology. It works so well for so many, and it doesn't reach everyone. With so many people suffering and psychedelics being positioned as a way to transcend suffering for so many, it's important to understand where our suffering comes from, what it's influenced by, where it lives in the body, and how we can transcend it on every socioeconomic level in this country and beyond. Arrowyn, thank you so much for inviting us into your beautiful home today to speak about a great deal of information, and recovery is going to be kind of at the forefront of our discussion, and there's so many ways that you can take us in this conversation. So where would you like to start?
Ooh. I'm like, ooh, where do I drop in here?
Yeah, drop in where needed.
Such a stew, right? It's like a bouillabaisse. Pull out a shrimp. Are there shrimp in bouillabaisse?
I don't know. Some kind of shellfish. There's
shellfish.
Allergies. Yeah, there's
allergies.
Concerns.
We don't want to eat bouillabaisse, probably. So I think what's important in regards to psychedelics and recovery, because that's probably the intersection, right?
It's a good intersection.
Yeah, and the work that I do, to give some context, I've been in recovery for 20 years, right? On a recovery journey. I wouldn't say I've been like clean and sober for 20 years because, one, I don't like that term anymore.
The term clean and sober?
Yeah,
okay.
I think it means the idea that you're clean or dirty.
Gotcha.
Right, doesn't feel inclusive to me.
Yeah.
At this part of my recovery journey, I'm very medically assisted treatment pro, harm reduction pro, very many roads to Rome of recovery, people defining recovery for themselves, and really looking at recovery from a place of, I have yet to meet someone who wants to stop doing something, but they can't. Who
wants to stop doing something, but they're unable to do it. You've rarely met someone in that position.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And so about 5 years ago, I have been a fundamentalist in the recovery, the gold standard of recovery, the 12 steps before for a good 11 years, like big book thumper, incredibly rigid. So I feel like I have a healthy relationship to that program, enough to be lovingly critical and to see really over the years where people fell out, where people were missing. For some people, that recovery journey is absolutely the one for them, and they thrive and are having huge arcs of personality changes and life changes. And then there were some people like myself that were kind of like, something's missing. My life is still crap. And not just that, but my relationships are really still a source of so much suffering. And there's still such a deep dysregulation in my body, the discomfort. Call it anxiety, call it generalized anxiety disorder, call it CPTSD, call it OCD, call it whatever the fuck you want, right?
We're talking about the body.
Yeah, can we swear?
You can say the F word.
Okay.
You have the F word blessing.
And so I came across a modality it's stabilizing and resourcing called the Resistance Toolkit. And it's a embodied, trauma-informed approach to stress and healing in the body that is deeply grounded in, trauma-informed principles, but also social justice. And when I was certified in that about 4 years ago, I took all that learning, because I work with individuals and organizations for Lumos Transforms where I work, and I turned that lens towards recovery and realized, wow, these are the missing pieces that really felt foundational for me to feel really recovered in my life. The substance had been gone for a while. It wasn't even an issue. So then I started embarking on this real deep healing journey of like, what does it mean to really become whole, which recovery is about, like kind of returning to ourselves. And something I came across was that recovery is incomplete with a dysregulated nervous system. So I can stop drinking, I can stop shopping, I can stop gambling, I can stop, there's certain things you can't stop, but if that dysregulation is still there, I'm just going to seek something else, right? So learning that we have internal resources we can utilize in any moment under 15 to 30 seconds that help me negotiate and navigate stress states was like, whoa, I wish other people knew this, especially in recovery, because so many people are suffering. And then on top of that, there's behavior change theory, which I love because that model, are you familiar with it? The trans-theoretical model of behavior change?
No, please elaborate.
Yeah, it was designed for recovery, for folks, alcoholics actually, and it is, it's been validated and studied and replicated, but it's this model that people are at different stages of recovery. In recovery, but people have a different relationship to behavior change based on the different stages that they're in. So some people
prior to getting involved in.
Yeah.
Okay.
So some people, there's the early stage, they're not ready, they're probably in denial, they won't show up at meetings, they won't show up in recovery. They're not even interested. They're like, I don't have a problem, right? Then there's the folks who are like, things are not going so well. I'm curious, but I'm not ready. Probably 6 months. And then something happens, and then they're like, oh, I'm ready now. And they might go to a few meetings, but they're not sure. Or they might try a couple things, but they're not sure. And then people commit. And then there's maintenance, and they do it for a while. And that's the honeymoon period, right? Usually about 6 months to a year. And then built into this model, which I love, 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 is a return. I call it a return back to another stage. We call it relapse in recovery, right? But it is built into this model that it's not if, but when you'll return. And so there's so much compassion in that and understanding that sometimes people have 5 to 7 returns in them before it's able to stick and you can get to longer term maintenance. And return may look like using the substance again. It may look like using it for a day. It may look like just thinking about it a lot. It may look like changing your recovery program, right? There's different ways to look at that. And there were 4 different ways that people sometimes make commitments to themselves that I've started working with people in. It's like, one, some people can make a promise to themselves and others and be fine. And they usually don't show up in recovery groups because they don't need anyone else. I know some of those people. I don't understand them. They're a different species. They're like, oh, I OD'd on crack one night. That was a bad idea. I'm not going to use any drugs or drink for another 20 years. I'm good, right? Who are those people? They're out there. We don't hear those stories very much in recovery because they don't need to, right?
Yeah.
Then there's obligers like myself. This is based on Gretchen Rubin's book, The 4 Tendencies. But it's like, obligers are really good at external accountability. I'll meet your commitment to you, come hell or high water, but to myself, fuck off, right? Like, no way. Those people do really well in recovery groups because that external accountability that's why meeting makers make it, which is a term when I was a fundamentalist, like pissed me off so much. So I'm like, no, it's the program, right? It's the steps. Then I realized, no, some people actually do really well just being in a community. And that's beautiful. And why would I want to take that away from anyone, right? And then there's people, and these are the 2 groups that I find don't do well in recovery. They're questioners. They have to question everything before they are able to make that commitment to themselves. You're not meant to question the gold standard of recovery, right? Take the cotton out of your mouth. No, take the cotton out of your ears, put it in your mouth. Some old school stuff, right? So they fall through the cracks. And then unless they have a really nuanced, special, sponsor. And then there's the rebels. And rebels have to do it their own way. They're not going to follow anything. They have to make it their own. And you're definitely not encouraged or, to make recovery your own, at least the steps, as we know if we're talking about that model.
Yeah.
So they fall through the cracks. So what I found as I was looking around in those rooms, in those spaces, I was like, people are falling through the cracks. And they're thinking it's their fault. They're blaming themselves when it's the model that's not supporting them. Are there other models out there? And then I looked at mine and I was like, wow, like if people really understood dysregulation of the nervous system and the body as being driving the thinking, driving the lens of the world, and they could go from that approach, I feel like there's so much more agency and efficacy to handle triggers, or you can call them trailheads, right? Like ways to learn more about yourself. if you're in a slip or a relapse or a return. And so the question I asked myself a lot was, how can we more normalize a return or a relapse without encouraging it? Because the thing with recovery is we know people can die, right? Like there's a lot on the line with a slip or a relapse.
Sure.
Right? And that's a scary thing. So I don't have the answers, but I do think psychedelics, if we're going to go in that direction, have a lot of potential. Alcoholics Anonymous, as well as most modes of psychology and healing, are cognitive, top-down approaches. That only works so well and with a certain group of people, I would say, right? And if we look at biology, actually bottom up, if it changes my thinking, I'm able to actually think clearer and make better decisions if I understand my biology and how I'm responding to stress in my life.
But not everyone will have the inclination to go into the science side of it either. They might be more inclined to go into the faith or spiritual or community aspect of support, right? So we're talking again about you're seeing the entire apparatus where it's lacking and where people aren't being served to the greatest potential of results, right? Yeah. So you started looking outwards for other options, and you discovered another system, another modality.
Yes. Yeah. And so I'm helping people now. I created the Toolkit for Recovery, which aligns this body-based approach with a trauma-informed awareness and lens, and deeply grounded in awareness of people's ecology, too. And I feel like it can support any mode of recovery you're in, whether it be abstinence or harm reduction, or wherever you are in your recovery journey. I've had people show up to the workshop and be like, I don't know why I signed up for this. And then they find out as we start talking that I can't stop something, but that I want to, but I can't. A woman was reading romance novels, and we scoff at that. But if you know, Dr. Gabor Mate talks about his compulsion to buy, I think it's like classical CDs, right? To the point of like putting his family's finances in jeopardy.
Wow.
And leaving a woman in labor to go buy, so these compulsive behaviors, he talks about addiction being a lack of connection. So these compulsive behaviors, and I think of it as a lack of connection to yourself first and foremost, like being able to know what's going on in your physiology so you can work with it. Because the way I respond to stress is different than the way you do.
And the compulsive behavior would indicate that disconnect?
Yeah. So I'm compulsively seeking something to regulate a dysregulated nervous system.
Okay.
So a dysregulated NARM, the neuroaffective relational model that I really like for addiction as well and recovery, talks about from childhood trauma, which we can ascertain and validate from the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, that childhood trauma is directly linked to addiction. Yeah. Right? So in the rooms, I started to find it very odd too that people are like, I don't know why I'm an addict. And, it doesn't have to do with my family. And I'm like, probably has to do with something in your childhood or young adulthood.
But the carrying capacity for the formal program just doesn't allow for those kind of tributary explorations.
Yes. Yeah. No, it doesn't. It actually actively discourages against seeking, or at least in the fundamentalist group I was in, was like, you don't need therapy, you don't need medication, you just need to do the steps harder. Yeah. And with someone better, maybe, right? And I was working with the Big Book Awakenings, if anyone knows that. It's sort of a really intense way of taking every line into a question. And working with people like Mark Houston and Joe Hawk and some of these famous older people, but the rigidity of that, right? I don't know what you need. Right. And I don't know what tools you need actually to settle a dysregulated nervous system. So NARM says, the neuroaffective relational model says, from childhood trauma, we have complex PTSD is where there's a series of, it's chronic dysregulation, a difficulty ascertaining whether my body is safe or not. And so that creates a lot of dysregulation that we seek to regulate at any cost biologically, even if the cost is our life. So I'll smoke that cigarette for those 5 minutes of knowing it's going to kill me. I will take that whiskey shot knowing what could happen because I just need a break, right? I just need settling of this. And what if you could settle that with other things? So you've come to understand this, though. The information, you've sought it out. It makes sense to you. You can incorporate it into your mind, into your imagination.
And not everybody can experience and process information the same way. So you're finding a way to practically share, to structure and educate.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the combination of all of it, like I don't think I'm the panacea, right? I don't think the 12 steps is the panacea. I think there's a combination of both. I think it's mind and body, right? But we've left out the body so much. But yeah, it's like teaching people these small little practices, little bit over time, yields these huge sustainable results. And what's hard for people, and we talked about this, you know, when we first spoke, was like our culture loves the big breakthrough model of healing. It loves, especially the group breakthrough model of healing, emotional catharsis, like retreat model, rehabilitation, psychedelics, right? And I told you in 2015 was, before I met the model I work with now, was like, I heard of ayahuasca, and it was 10 years of therapy in 2 nights, and I just was going through a very terrifying divorce, and I was feeling so broken inside, and I'd been sober 11 years, clean and sober 11 years, and so rigid in that program, and man, I could talk to hundreds of people about my belief in God that would keep me sober. And then when the shit hit the fan, and I'd done the steps maybe 8 or 9 times with better and better sponsors, when the rug got pulled out of me, I realized I don't believe in God. That's not my God. Judeo-Christian patriarchal terms are not my terms. This is not my model. And I tried ayahuasca, right? I was like, yeah, I want the big cathartic experience. I want to get her done. And the potential of psychedelics to rewire the brain is huge, right? Huge. But what we find, and what you and I spoke about, the ability to take that state change, the big peak experience state change, and build the bridge to everyday trait change, very difficult to do. It's being done better in the newer kind of wave of psychedelic therapeutic models with like Johns Hopkins and these places really holding people's hands for integration. But generally, I think people are looking at this model in recovery and going, yeah, like, and I heard people in the class I was in, the Psychedelics Re-envisioned at Antioch with Dr. David Tripp, that I hope you get to interview. Little plug for you, Mr. Tripp. Was a lot of recovery folks were like, whoa, kind of like I want to, but I don't, you know? It was like the potential for healing is great, but the potential for harm is also great. And I found when I broke my clean and sober title at 11 years by doing ayahuasca, it's like there's something called the abstinence violation effect, which is also interesting in harm reduction, that if you're so abstinent from something and that rigidity, the second you do it, you go the fuckets is what I call it, right? You can have it with alcohol, with carbs. Anyone doing like the low carb knows, right?
The floodgates are open.
Yeah, and I'm not promoting moderation with substances that will kill you, like at all. But, and I don't have all the answers, but these are the questions I live in daily and wonder and want to help more people understand that there are tools. And the problem with trying to sell a program like mine is it's not emotional catharsis. It's the opposite. It's like, don't overflood your system with too much sensation, because that's re-traumatizing. Let's do little bits at a time and really get curious about what you need, because it's different than what I need in any moment with any state you're in, right? If you're in a nervous system stress state, what you need in that moment might be butterfly hug, it might be breath work. I probably just knocked my mic there, right? Might be breath work, it might be meditation, it might be movement, it might be running. I don't know, right? But like working individually with people to help them find out what's going to work for them, getting them real curious before they want to use something or compulsive behavior. What state are you in? What do you think the thing is going to do for you? Where's it going to take you, right? We look at maps of the nervous system. And then you get to be super selective. Well, I want to wake up, right? My tweaker friends, I don't even like that term. My meth addicted friends in recovery, they're always talking about, I want to wake up. I want to feel alive. I want to like feel sharp and alive, because they're probably stuck in it's actually a really high stress state called freeze. That's a numb, shut down state, protective, but in short term, long term, very hard to sustain. Their body is biologically seeking to wake up, to come out of it, to drop into the fight flight of activation. So they love uppers, right? I'm someone who lives in hypervigilance, that anxiety, that place. I want the edge to be taken off.
Yeah.
I want alcohol. I want
Right.
downers, right? There are tools that can wake you up if you're in that state. And if you're in a free state, it's generally not good to meditate because that could exacerbate the free state. So getting people to learn, oh, I need to look out. I need to move. I need to like pay attention. But if I'm in a super activated state, I need to actually activate to be able to sit. So there's the relaxation response to healing and there's the arousal response to healing. And our culture has definitely overemphasized relaxation response without the activation or the arousal.
Is the relaxation response part of the 12-step program?
I'd say the meditation,
Yeah.
right? The emphasis on meditation, which
Yeah.
very few people can do,
Uh-huh.
especially if you're highly traumatized.
Sure.
I have a lot of caveats about mindfulness meditation also being the panacea for everything, right? It's good for some folks in some states,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of different ways to get your body and your mind closer to what's called the social engagement system, which is a deep presence to it where I can connect to me and you, and I can regulate. Like I have all my feelings, it's very present to everything that's going on, but I got this, right? People often confuse that state with a free state, which is a shut down, numb. And a lot of spiritual bypassing happens that way, I've noticed. And in the community of Alcoholics Anonymous, I've seen that a lot too. Like, don't get angry, don't have feelings, you're not, it's that like I'm sort of unaffected by things means I'm healed. Where I feel like actually being able to be affected by everything but not be taken out by it is more wholeness to me, right? I want to feel grief. I want to feel anger. I want to feel joy and sadness,
So I think some people who are familiar with the history of AA know that LSD was at one point in time a consideration to be an integral component of the healing process.
Yes.
Can you speak to that a little bit? Have you researched that and dug into it yourself?
Of course.
Yeah,
I've researched a lot of Bill W.'s strategies,
histories, and hopes and dreams.
Yep.
And what we're getting at really is the exploration of the body, of the physiology, of the nature of trauma, of why these habituated patterns develop and stick and how they can be transcended, right?
Yeah, well, I know from what I've read at least, and I could be wrong, obviously, and quite often am, that's okay, but Bill W. was still suffering from depression, and so that's a freeze state, that's a pretty high stress state. So, and he was also, I know, very curious about how to help. He knew people were going to fall through the cracks of Alcoholics Anonymous, that way of approaching a spiritual experience was not going to resonate with everyone.
Yeah.
And so I know part and parcel of his LSD experimentation was for his own depression, but also to feel like, how can we create a spiritual experience, a mystical experience for people that will help them stay and want to be sober, knowing the Judeo-Christian model wasn't going to work for everyone. And what I find really interesting in what we know about psychedelics is they create a mystical experience, the awe, right? That awe and wonder that we can find in nature or with psychedelics, that can be such a deeply transformative, like changing experience in and of itself. But again, if it's not brought into daily life, he was on belladonna when he had his like big like epiphany, right? He was on a substance. So we see that is part and parcel of like possibly a recovery journey. But what I find really interesting when I was learning, because I've struggled with the God concept a lot, it doesn't resonate with me. And also if we're going with a disease model, what kind of disease do we treat with faith? If we're really looking at like, this is a medical model, right? Which I don't agree with. But what I do think is interesting, when I started really looking at how to work with the nervous system, when I started exploring my own sense of settling and relaxation, what did that feel like? It felt like faith. The closer I got to my social engagement system, and if you've been jacked up in hypervigilance for a long time, it takes a while. And it's very disorienting and can feel very unsafe to leave that state at first. So it's not a sexy and glamorous ride that you'd want it to be. So coming out of that was very disorienting, right? And the ride wasn't as fluid as I wanted it to be. And so coming into more of social engagement, though, I realized the glimmers I would make into it were like, whoa, like this must be what people feel when they feel faith. Everything's going to be okay. I'm okay. There's time for everything. My thinking is spacious. I'm like, I care about you and I care about my neighbor. and I care about long term, and I'm creative, and I'm like problem solving, and that's a state I was never in because I was so, into my hypervigilance of like
survival.
Where's the danger from my childhood, right?
Yeah.
And then I was like, oh, that's faith. That might be there's a lot of physical things that happen in some religions where you stand up, you sit down, you do like things like you move the body in certain ways. I'm like, oh, and if we get really nerdy about it, it's about the vagus nerve and polyvagal theory, which is the science behind this giant wandering nerve in the body that's responsible for all these things. And so you can innervate the vagus nerve in different ways, knowing what you need and when. Sometimes you need gentle rocking. Sometimes you need touch. Sometimes you need to go inside. Sometimes you need to go out, right? So this is like, how do we figure this out? There's no one size fits all. And so what I find is that I was talking with my friend who's still rigid in that program, my bestie, and she's always talking about how do I get my sponsees to go to God, to go to God, to go to God with everything, right? That's what we're told in the program. Like that's how you give your will, third step, right? I give it over to God, I give it over to God. And I was like, that's so funny because I actually, when I'm working with my clients and my folks, how do I get them to keep practicing the tools so they get closer to this sense of I'm okay, where my body's functioning, I can rest, I can sleep, I have immunity, right? We're both trying to do the same thing. She's coming at it from a theoretical standpoint, this sort of like, top down, like God. I'm like using the body to get to the same place. Also, if you have people's ecology, this piece, like if I'm suffering with stuff in my personal ecology, if I'm a person of color in this country, and that's in chronic poverty, I can go to a rehab, I can have a different state in that rehab, but when I come back, I'm in my same ecology, right? If that doesn't change, the reason I'm so disorganized and dysregulated, that's not going to change. And if I'm only relying on something external like a sponsor or a meeting or a substance, right? I love teaching people there's things in your body that can actually work. They're not going to be as strong as a narcotic or a shot of whiskey or a shot of heroin or that. Absolutely. But if you practice it daily over time, it will get there. And there's a tool I use called the therapeutic tremor, which is very little understood, but it's probably the most powerful tool in the toolkit. And it has the power to knock you out of hypervigilance and to really quickly reset the nervous system. And it's biological. It's in all of us. As mammals, we're meant to shake and tremor and vibrate tension out.
How are people discovering the Resilience Toolkit?
That's a great question. I just talk about it on my Instagram site.
Yeah.
Pretty much. My work, Lumos Transforms, encourages me to make little videos that I hate doing, but have to.
Yeah.
I try to go on, I'm working with an app right now called New Life that just came out for recovery that looks like I can do individual work there and also do the workshop. I have a 3-part workshop. But other than that, it's really hard. It's really hard because I'm not a licensed clinician. I can't go into some of the recovery spaces and rehabilitation centers because I'm not licensed. What I do is very therapeutic, but it's really simple too. It's really basic about biology. I'm not healing trauma. I'm helping people resource and stabilize so they can do deeper healing with someone else with a modality that speaks to them. It might be talk therapy, it might be EMDR, I don't know. It might be equestrian shit, whatever. It could be art making, it could be psychedelics.
Yeah.
Right? But I think if people are more stabilized and resourced before they do psychedelics, if you're going for a big peak experience healing modality, you're going to have more capacity to integrate that if you know how to regulate before.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I'm passionate about. That's what I do. I help people stabilize and resource because most people come to recovery in chaos and crisis.
Sure. Well, let me ask you a far out question that kind of ties to that idea. Not maybe knowing entirely why we are going through the experience of what we've deemed a human being on what we call a planet.
Yeah.
Is it possible that some of us have chosen the experience of addiction in order to work through some kind of karmic debt or create some kind, because when you talk about how unfathomable it is, the suffering that some people endure as compared to maybe just somebody else's life down the same street or whatever, it's just...
Yeah, like why did we choose that?
How did it happen that way? And then sometimes you have to rationalize about what's going on in your own life. And, something I hear a lot is that any kind of suffering or hardship that I've endured, I've chosen for myself, right? We hear that, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
It's just something that comes to mind, because you would think no one would choose that for themselves. No one would choose to have the things that we call trauma like occur through or to them, right?
Yeah.
And then the resultant coping mechanisms or habituated behaviors that can spring from that from a biological origin, right? So
yeah, I'll say I grew up, I sometimes say, I joke that I'm a recovered New Age metaphysicist, right? Like I grew up with my mom being very into tarot and astrology and dream interpretation and seances and seeing men being channeled through a woman who were 800 years old from the Pleiades, right? Like that was my religious, spiritual upbringing. Inherent in that is what I heard a lot, like if I had a stomach ache, what is it you don't, like what is it you don't want to feel? Earache, what is it you don't want to hear? And everything was, you chose this. And so I heard that a lot too. And I think there's some of that in AA, right? In that part of the process of like, you play a part in all of your circumstances. And I get that to a degree. I also think there's a bit of spiritual bypassing in that, right? You can manifest and you chose this too, right? So what lesson do you have to learn from everything? What is the lesson to learn? You must have chosen this on some part. Mm-hmm. I think that's problematic in some ways, especially if we're talking about social justice, because do people choose racism?
Or do people choose to be born how they're born,
right.
where they're born, looking how they're looking, whatever?
Right, and so can we, I love, there's Rawls's theory of justice talks about the original position under the veil of ignorance of this idea that if we all took away, if we didn't know society's hierarchy, would we choose the society we're in, right? Absolutely not, obviously.
If we didn't know society...
Like if I didn't know I was going to be a white person in America, would I support racism, racialized capitalism, right? If I didn't know I wasn't going to be born into, right? It's a tough concept. I've been struggling with it myself. But the idea is that we wouldn't, like I struggle with the notion that people choose addiction to learn. I believe everybody is impacted by trauma on some level. Not to make it ubiquitous and the cause for everything, but I believe inherent in the human condition are traumatic experiences because inherently, well, mostly in, I'd say, our Western dominant culture because we aren't taught to integrate traumatic experiences so they're not trauma stuck bracing in the body and create that dysregulation. Other cultures, they have dancing, drumming, humming, singing, ways of moving together and being in community, spiritual practices, qigong, tai chi, right? There's other ways, like the Kalahari Bushmen, right? That they're called the keepers of the shake. It's that kind of idea that we are meant to actually move through stressful events. Our culture is like, do not have uncontrollable movement, right? Like repress. That creates that dysregulation. Where we seek to regulate, I think it's fascinating. Some of us chose substances. Other people choose romance novels. Some people find, right, sex or shopping or right? And I think, like, I used to be of the ilk that, like, alcoholism is a very specific disease. It's different than drug addiction. We should never mix the two. And I was very rigid and fundamentalist about that. Now I'm like, I don't give a fuck what it is, right? Like, we're all suffering on some level, everyone. There's nothing special about me because I chose alcohol. It was just the vehicle that worked for me and eventually became my downfall. So I find, like, do we choose to suffer? Is that part of the human condition? And is it bypassing to say, I chose this to learn, or is that making sense of it? I do find people who have been to hell and back to be my people, but I also have yet to meet someone who hasn't suffered, who isn't suffering, or who doesn't experience confounding dysregulation and seek something, and have been taught mostly by parents and everyone else, seek an external resource. We're shown that alcohol is this great social thing.
Yeah.
It is a toxic fucking drug. It is one of the most toxic. So looking at like culture, you know, so I don't know if I answered the question or I just rambled on, but.
Well, I think it just kind of all boils back to the fact that what can we really expect of ourselves looking at what we've done so far? How great of an exponential leap are we able to make in terms of like remedying where we haven't lived to our potential, so that others can live to their potential? Like, you know, because in the very most basic level, when you look at somebody who is suffering so intensely from addiction in particular, it's hard to feel like that's okay. You know, and it's hard not to wonder what might have been different in that organism's experience of life that could have set them up to have an experience that they would raise their hand and say, this is less painful than what I've been through.
I mean, it's like working with the unhoused. It's like my older brother is a, you know, recurring, relapsing drug addict. And watching him go through life that way is so painful. And he also has no interest in what I teach. Doesn't think trauma has anything to do with what he's experiencing, why he keeps returning to drugs. Like I said, my partner has no interest and suffers. And just to see, I feel like people who are in recovery and who work with people too, or want to give back in that way, it's heartbreaking Sisyphean work, right? You're like always pushing the boulder up the hill and it feels like it falls down at night. And that's where I go, because we're catching the babies as they come down the river, right? We're like catching the babies, and this is where I go to my social justice piece, ecology. I'm like, why don't we go up to the river, the mouth of the river, and go, why are the babies being thrown in, right? Chronic poverty, racial capitalism creates a lot of dysregulation. It creates child abuse. When I worked in probations and prison, in the probation camps, in the prisons with men experiencing incarceration, the youth, the stories of childhood chronic poverty, number one.
I want to make a jump from that to the mystical again. And I'd just like for you to tell me what you think are mystical experiences that you encounter on a daily basis.
Oh, looking at my daughter, the fact that she's alive and breathing and eating, and like that this person grew in my body. Still, you know, I struggle with God, but I'm like, if there's any, like, I can't argue with that. Like, how the fuck did that happen?
It's impossible not to be reverential about that mystery, right?
And it's not an experience I think everyone needs to have by any means. As we know, there's some people that are real crap at it, but like that fills me with awe on a daily basis. The fact that I woke up alcohol-free today, there's awe in that too, to me, because of the way I drink, the way I, can imbibe those substances. It's like, I didn't, and I feel good. Like, that's kind of mystical for me. Nature, always, and we know that's one of the biggest. And psychedelics can, MDMA, ketamine, psilocybin, ayahuasca, right? They are known to produce those deep mystical experiences. But then we have to look at like, what's the definition of a mystical experience?
Yeah, I just wanted to hear what it was like for you on a daily, without any kind of infusion or ingestion or altering of what you've got, and what's the baseline? I mean, we're always changing, right? But just on its own.
Yeah, nature, love, feeling love.
Yeah.
I think too, and this is what I used to say too, I would find God, for lack of a better word in this context, when I would go into a prison and I'd have men come in self-selecting, so a very type of inmate or person experiencing incarceration, and these men would say, it's wild, the wind just came up.
Yeah.
These men would come in and be from very different ethnicities and affiliations and be looking at each other like, the fuck are you doing here? What am I doing here? And like have absolute othering happening, like you are other. And we start with a couple of rounds of like, tell a story about your favorite childhood toy. Tell a story about someone who had your back growing up, or like, what does it feel like to trust someone? And those can be problematic, obviously, for not every prompt is great for everyone, but just to say that, like, after a couple of rounds, to feel everyone soften and to see them as brother, not other.
It's a pretty mystical experience.
And that happening, I did that for 10 years at work. Like, that always felt like, I was like, oh, there's something to this. There's something really powerful going on here, and it's not of me. It's beyond, it's bigger than me. It's bigger than all of us, you know? And it's so moving and so powerful and really beautiful.
Thank you for taking the time to speak
Yeah.
about all of these complexities. I think in a way, and I think by endeavoring to have the conversations, we can hope that we're always creating a landscape where more communication can happen, right?
Yes.
And like you just alluded to, in those groups where the communication was openly shared, it does change the dynamic,
Yes.
right? It changes
Yes.
what's possible.
Yes, and that we're all different. Like, I love that we have different experiences and different ways to recovery and different journeys and different modalities that resonate, and there's no one size fits all to anything
The Resilience Toolkit
for recovery.
for recovery
Yes.
can be found.
Right now it's on hiatus, but look out for it at Lumos Transforms. We're talking about reinvesting in it. But right now I think I will be offering it at New Life.
Okay.
It's a recovery app, so I'll be doing online workshops there and also working with individual clients through there. But you can also just reach out to me at Lumos and I can work individually with folks that way as well.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was so fun. I love talking about this shit. It's my favorite thing.
So that's my conversation with Arrowyn Ambrose. So happy to have a chance to speak with her. Interesting to think about the body in recovery. If you are considering recovery or you are in recovery, if you're struggling with your recovery, if you are in the throes of addiction, I hope that you found something in this show. The body is involved in the process of addiction. The body is involved in the process of confronting and transcending our trauma. And fortunately, there are people out there like Arrowyn who are doing the research, who are connecting the dots, who are putting the thought and time into learning about how to work with our body and our spirit in the process of going through a recovery system like the 12 steps, like Alcoholics Anonymous, or other methodologies that people are utilizing to live the best lives they possibly can. So we appreciate you listening, and we'll be back with another episode very soon.
Global Track Solutions Inc. and Psychedelic Spotlight does not in any way encourage or condone the use, purchase, sale, or transfer of any illegal substances, nor do we encourage or condone partaking in any unlawful activities. We support a harm reduction approach for the purpose of education and promoting individual and public safety. If you are choosing to use psychedelic substances, please do so responsibly.